Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Our topic for today, driving procure-to-pay returns beyond implementation. Before we get started, one word of advice. If you have questions as we go through today's program, please type those into the Q&A chat box and we'll do our best to address as many of your questions as we can at the conclusion of today's webinar. My name is Richard Waugh. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Development at Zycus, your host for today's webinar. I get involved in a lot of different things, including these types of activities, thought leadership kind of programs. And for today's session, we're going to be talking about the evolution of the procure-to-pay space. And I guess I have the advantage of longevity, if nothing else. So I can recall when this space was first originated, and spent a long time at GE, which was one of the pioneers in deploying procurement technology in some of the early days. So I've been on the bleeding edge of this and glad to be now in sort of the age of enlightenment as the evolution has come forward, and a lot of exciting opportunities in P2P today to drive greater and greater returns beyond the initial implementations, as our theme for today suggests. Let me tell you a little bit about Zycus just before we get started. We are an end-to-end provider of source-to-pay, a software technology and integrated suite of modules that includes procure-to-pay, and we've been consistently recognized as a leader in this market, for instance, with Gartner's Magic Quadrant for suite vendors. In the last 3 iterations of the report, consistently in the Leaders Quadrant, the 3rd consecutive time just this year in 2017. And kind of what that means, you can see we're plotted on this quadrant here with all of our closest friends and erstwhile competitors, but firmly positioned in that upper right-hand quadrant, which is the neighborhood you want to reside in as a leader, and cited for high levels of customer satisfaction, strong, consistent functionality across the suite of source-to-pay tools, and really a good market, strong market understanding and path forward and vision for the future. And we will be talking some about the vision for the future today as well. So just to give you a visual image of what the source-to-pay suite consists of, that footprint starts with spend analytics, e-sourcing, contract and supplier management, procure-to-pay, really our topic for today, and financial savings management as a way to tie it all together, and after all, give procurement credit for all the value being delivered. So it's my pleasure then, without further ado, to introduce Jon Hansen, who's the editor and lead writer at Procurement Insights. Jon will really be our keynote speaker for today's topic about P2P and driving returns beyond implementation. And Jon has written extensively in this space, 3,000 articles and papers, 5 books on subjects as diverse as supply chain practices, public sector policy, emerging business trends, and media. And Jon is a sought-after speaker and moderator. He also is the host of a highly acclaimed talk radio Window on the World show that's aired more than 800 episodes, a 2-time Ottawa finalist for the E&Y Entrepreneur of the Year Award, and many other merits and solicitations and citations here. So without further ado, Jon, welcome today, and let's get started.
Well, thank you, Richard. And I've got to tell you, just to, before we get into this, remind everyone that following the webinar today, you can join us on a tweet chat with the hashtag P2P Flywheel Chat. And oftentimes these discussions are good because certainly we'll endeavor to answer all of your questions within the time frame we're allotted today. However, if you want to take further discussion and have a free-flowing conversation beyond the webinar itself, this is a great venue to apprise yourself of. And Richard, I've got to point out, it's kind of interesting, you'd mentioned the years that you've been involved in the early days, right?
Absolutely. I was there at the beginning.
So, it's kind of interesting. So you and I both started when we were 10 years old, right?
We did. Child labor.
But you know, it's interesting as we get into this discussion and move forward into it, is that historic perspective that you gain, having been in the industry so long, and I've been there from the very, very early days as well. It's interesting to step back and look and see how the industry has transitioned. And oftentimes, as we're going through those periods, you're sort of myopically focused on what's happening in that particular time, like a snapshot. Whereas I think what we gain, Richard, is that historical evolutionary perspective where we can look back and see how all the pieces have come together, some case naturally, some case challenge-wise. But I think that gives a great insight into not only where we've been, but also helping us to sort of figure out where we might be going. I mean, would you agree with that, Richard?
I do. There's some advantage to having already made so many mistakes not to repeat them.
That's true. That's true. So let's go on to the next slide in terms of that. But remember, the tweet chat's a great venue afterwards. Now, what we're going to cover on today's agenda is three key areas. The first is the Gartner Postmodern ERP Era. What does that mean? It was a very, very interesting article and assessment by Gartner as to how the industry has changed and transitioned from the ERP days. And, of course, enterprise resource planning solutions, organizations still have them, obviously, as a big part of what they do. But it's really how is that transitioned into where we are today? What went wrong with ERP-based purchasing? And there were challenges, and I'll touch on this in a little bit more detail. But historically, the vast majority of ERP-driven e-procurement solutions ultimately failed to deliver the expected results. So what went wrong with that? And, of course, will P2P purchasing solutions avoid the ERP legacy trap? And what makes P2P different? And one of the questions that, you know, really come to my mind is, in this transition period, how much has the procurement profession or professional influenced technology, and how much has technology influenced the procurement professional? And that's a concept that I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we progress through this. So these are the three areas that we're going to focus on today. Now, one of the things is creating a set of time or what you can call a framework of understanding. And many of us are familiar with the book Good to Great by Jim Collins. And one of the two fascinating concepts within that book was the flywheel effect and the doom loop. And I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the Collins book, and it's a timeless work that continues to provide a relevant reference point that is really ubiquitous. It applies across all industries, all sectors. Richard, you've read Good to Great, right?
Oh yes. I'm still on that journey, by the way, trying to get from good to great.
Well, you know what? I think I'm in my 5th reading of it, and I think every time I read through the book, I learn something new. So either I'm a slow learner or there's always hidden treasures within that. But we're going to use the flywheel and the doom loop as a reference point for comparing the ERP era to where the P2P era is going, and within that framework, we'll find out the clues and the insights to help us to be able to differentiate between the two. Now, in terms of this session, it's very much going to be an interactive session. So as Richard mentioned, please post questions on the Q&A as we go along. We'll not only answer them at the end, but certainly we'll engage with you during the actual session itself. But we're also going to be introducing a number of polls, and this is the first one. And one of the things we want to understand is your current solution ERP-based today? So take a few moments. I think there's about 30 seconds in there. And, you know, answer, is it yes, no, not sure? Now, Richard, going back to the old days in terms of the ERP-based solution, I mean, and I notice you've had some experience as an industry analyst. I mean, what is your concept and experience looking back now on ERP-based solutions versus, you know, what they were back then and what our historical's perspective is? What is your take?
Well, certainly, as I recall, John, I think most of the earliest adopters of procure-to-pay technology got their start with whatever solution their incumbent ERP happened to provide. And after all, this was before the advent, at least widespread adoption of cloud technology, so the ERP was on-premise behind the firewall. The P2P was tightly integrated, in fact, part of that P2P package, and you know, was certainly you know, intertwined, you know, inextricably with internal accounting systems and those kinds of things. Now, fast forward, there's been a lot of change with the availability of cloud and open systems to drive those integrations. So I do think that many of the first adopters utilized their ERP tools, and of course may have found that they didn't get the kinds of adoption because it didn't have the usability that they really needed for end users.
Got it. Now, the poll results have come in, and 67% still have an ERP-based solution, 33% don't. Does that surprise you, those numbers, Richard?
Actually, I'm surprised that it's still as high as it is, you know, better than 2/3 using ERP, and not to suggest that ERP is going anywhere. You know, there's that requirement for that system of record, that transactional platform, but certainly I would have expected the adoption of, let's say, a best-of-breed solution for procure-to-pay to be, you know, at least on a par with the ERP. But this says, you know, that there's still a significant installed base using the ERP model.
Well, you know, and that is a kind of an interesting factor, because you mentioned something that makes a lot of good sense, is the ERP model isn't going to be disappearing anytime soon, because it has its purpose in the back end as the foundation, I guess, from the financial standpoint, correct?
Absolutely, and I think the model that's evolved is one of peaceful coexistence, that the two can, in fact, complement one another. When you've got a best-of-breed P2P tool that has that proverbial, you know, Amazon, Google type consumer experience, you know, integrated to and complementing the backbone financial transaction system, which is ERP.
Well, you know, as we progress to the next slide with the context of what you just said, I mean, Gartner wrote a report, an article saying that we are now in the postmodern ERP era. Maybe this goes, Richard, to a certain degree of explaining some of that, because in the past, historically with ERP solutions, and I had alluded to this earlier, that the vast majority of ERP-based e-procurement initiatives failed to achieve the expected results. Some put the numbers as high as 80%. So, but that doesn't mean that ERPs do not have a place within the enterprise, obviously, and with 67% of the people having an ERP-based solution, it shows its prevalence. But one of the things that Gartner pointed out is that they said that flexibility, or sufficient flexibility to meet changing business demands, was one of the anchors that actually had a negative impact on e-procurement solutions that were based on an ERP platform. Now, in its heyday, the reason why CEOs and business executives selected ERP solutions was the fact that there was an integrated ability to do this, that you had one back-end system behind the wall prior to the emergence of the cloud, and you had everything self-contained in one place. So they wanted reliability and they wanted integration, and so they thought or viewed ERPs as the way to deal with this. But the error, or I guess the misassumption, and Richard, I don't know what word you would add to this, is that just because these qualities exist in an application does not mean that they are going to extend out into all areas of functionality, especially with the procurement function, which I think it's safe to say is much more dynamic and demanding. I mean, one of the things that immediately come to mind in the early days, and the complaints I had from procurement professionals, is that when they sought to get functionality built into the ERP back end, it was almost like getting in line behind every other department who was having different requests to modify the application itself. Concerns also extended with the fact of intelligence and business insight that was needed to make progressive or proactive purchasing decisions, getting reports, or extracting data and intelligence from the back-end system was sometimes and usually a lengthy process, so that by the time the requested information was provided or received, it had lost its relevance. And so what ultimately happened in this postmodern ERP era that Gartner is referring to is that they realized the fact that we need to not only lower IT costs, we need to not only create a end-to-end solution capability, but we need flexibility. And to do that, we have to go beyond the back end. I mean, Richard, is that a reasonable assessment, do you think?
Oh, I think it absolutely is. And, you know, what strikes me too, John, is sort of beyond all the technology, there's always a human component to this, and I look back over the years, it's certainly striking how much more recognition there is within the C-suite of procurement's value to the business, and I think part of what's encapsulated in this postmodern ERP that Gartner talks about is the increased power within the procurement group because of that heightened stature to be able to push back, quite frankly, oftentimes on the IT group, which often would have favored the ERP system because, after all, it makes their life easier to manage one technology platform. But I think procurement these days has been much more successful in saying, no, if we're going to deliver the kinds of returns that the business expects, we need a best-of-breed solution in areas like procure-to-pay or across source-to-pay. So I think there's that human element that comes into play as well.
Well, you know, it's kind of interesting. I don't want to digress too far, but what you had said, that provides some great insight. One of the biggest challenges, and maybe you can speak to this as well, Richard, one of the biggest challenges in the past is that with the procure-to-pay solutions, and I don't want to jump too far ahead here, but the belief is that you can, with P2P, implement solutions at a fraction of the cost than, let's say, an ERP-based e-procurement solution. You can do it in weeks and days instead of what has been months and years. And so the recognition that this transition from an ERP era where, you know, how can we implement these solutions in such a short period of time when our ERP history tells us that we have to have years of being able to do that. I mean, that was an obstacle to adoption to a certain degree, wasn't it? Is the belief that you could transition from what you can call an onerous or overarching ERP implementation to, at least from the procurement side of the equation, to be able to do something that could be put into place within a relatively short period of time at a fraction of the cost and deliver exceptional values. I mean, that was one of the key obstacles, wouldn't you say, from adoption?
I would, John, and you know, I think the reality is a CEO or even a CFO may not appreciate or understand all the nuances of what happens in procurement, but one of the things we'll touch on later is just how robust a business case you can make for transforming procure-to-pay, for example. And one thing that they certainly do understand is ROI and the time value of money. So when we contrast the proposition behind, just as you say, a best-of-breed cloud-based solution and getting that up and running in a matter of weeks or a few months instead of years with the ERP, which is often the case, the C-suite certainly understands the time value of money and you know, not leaving those kinds of you know, returns on the table when you can look directly at how it falls right to the bottom line, how it improves earnings per share. That's the language that the C-suite speaks, and I think that's another very compelling argument that procurement can put forth to drive these kinds of initiatives.
See, and within that context and within the statement of and the quote of the impact of cloud and emergence of postmodern ERP will relegate highly customized ERP solutions to legacy status, I think we want to caution this, that one of the things we were saying is it's not so much that we are criticizing ERP or Gartner is criticizing these back-end ERP solutions. It's more or less an understanding as to where they are most effective, and the tools related to P2P and integration can extend outside of again, a single back-end system. I mean, that's really what we're saying to a certain degree, Richard, is we're not criticizing ERP. Certainly Gartner isn't doing that, but they're looking at the ERP through a new lens of saying, look, we have to see where the strengths are and where we have to integrate, and we can integrate outside of the ERP back-end. It doesn't have to be resident in one place. I mean, is that a fair statement, Richard?
It is, and I kind of hone in on this highly customized and how those become legacy status. I mean, we talked a little bit about cloud technology and how prevalent that's becoming. So even in the ERP space, which I would have thought would have been the last bastion of, you know, the technology that's firmly ensconced behind the firewall, there are a lot of companies looking at taking their ERP to the cloud as well and looking at the benefits of a more standard-based approach as opposed to a custom behind the firewall solution that's very difficult for them to maintain.
Now, one of the biggest challenges, and this was interesting, facing purchasing leaders is that at bigger organizations is to, and I thought this was an interesting mindset, escape the constraining clutch of legacy enterprise systems. I mean, when you hear that, Richard, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you say the constraining clutch? Is it suggesting that what we're talking about here is that the ERP systems are sort of imprisoning people? Like what does that mean in your estimate?
Yeah, you know, for me, I again come back to this human element, and you know, the fact that there's a difference between a system of record, which the ERP is, you know, keeping track of you know, general ledger and the financial systems, inventory management, those kinds of things, and a system of engagement, you know, something that end users, especially the, you know, the next wave that's entering the workforce, the millennials, as the baby boomers like me fade off and retire and those kinds of things, there's an expectation there that, you know, that generation that's grown up on Facebook and Amazon and Google want that kind of engaging experience. And I think that, to me, in many ways, that constraining clutch is, you know, you're never going to get the kind of widespread adoption with that kind of transactional-oriented system. It comes down to user experience for me.
Well, you know, and I want to remind everyone who's listening here, the terms that Richard uses, the transactional element to it, and the confinement of it. That's something I wanted you to store in the back of your mind for later, because that's going to come into full focus momentarily. But as the transformation takes back, you know, Gartner. And this sort of ties it all together. Gartner reported that, look, we're going to be surprised at how much ERP system actually limited what purchasing could do. And it's kind of an interesting element there, because, and Richard referred to the fact that, you know, there's a human element to it. I remember Larry Ellison of Oracle saying, you know, there's no such thing as the cloud. We all remember that famous discussion and that famous reference point. We've always been in the cloud. But what's interesting is that it's how you define the cloud and how it operates within the ERP realm. I do believe it has limited, and that's the result. And we talk about things, and I'll go into this momentarily, that cause through the doom loop side of the equation, maverick spending, vendor rationalization. A lot of the procurement practices or elements were brought about not because they were the best way to do things, but because in the past we had to adapt or adopt to the way in which the technology worked. We were put into a forced compliance. And what that did is force procurement professionals to operate in a way that wasn't conducive or reflective of how the real world operates. And with the cloud technology, as we go through this process today, with P2P and the emergence of these solutions, they are more reflective of how procurement professionals operate and work in the real world. Now, I was talking about the doom loop, what went wrong in terms of the ERP. And again, those of you who are familiar with the Good to Great book, you'll understand in terms of the direction and the ideas and the starting points of ERP solutions and the challenges that went through. And we'll touch on this, the no accumulated momentum, that traction couldn't be gained. Disappointing results were certainly part of the reflection of what was happening, and then reaction without understanding. And it's in that gap between, I believe, reaction without understanding that continues the doom loop, that we have enforced compliance, that we have vendor rationalization strategies, that we have all of these kinds of elements. I think a lot of the strategies that we employed in the past within the procurement realm were, again, a direct byproduct of the technology or the limitation of what Gartner now calls legacy technology, and not reflective of how we work in the real world. Now, here's our second poll. And, you know, your opinion counts here, and certainly if you hear anything that you don't agree with or you'd like to add your thoughts on there, there's the Q&A section here. But the next poll is, what do you believe went wrong with ERP-based procurement? Was it too costly? Timelines too long for implementation? Was there a lack of procurement department involvement? or was there a misalignment of technology? And that last point is important because remember, the whole concept and the belief with regards to the ERP-based platform was that it provided an end-to-end synchronicity across all areas of operations of an enterprise. So take a few minutes and let us know and share with us what you believe were the problems or challenges in that regard. And Richard, I bet you probably have a few ideas in this area, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And the first thing that comes to mind is we've made it tough for the audience because I think many would be tempted to pick a fifth choice if one were there, which would be all of the above. Right? If you look at many of these, I think most folks would say all of these had an impact, but we're really kind of doing a forced ranking exercise here is to say which one of these was the most onerous or, was the most glaring challenge that you experienced with ERP-based procurement, because frankly, I think they all come into play.
Now, it's kind of interesting going back to the results of the first poll where, and again, you had expressed surprise, 67% still have an ERP-based solution. Certainly, I was a little bit surprised by that because I thought the numbers certainly would have been far lower in that regard. I mean, does this make these kinds of questions more challenging for people who are answering this poll?
Yeah, or at least maybe more painful, because that would say if they're experiencing these, they're still living through those. They haven't gotten beyond that. But be interesting to see what sort of jumps to the top here. But I think these are all things that could have been experienced.
Well, it's funny already out of the gate. 7% said too costly, 14% said implementation timeline, that seems to be a big one, lack of procurement department involvement, and technology misalignment. But here's the thing, 69% have no answer. What do you make of that?
I don't think it's that nothing went wrong. I think it's, and in part, sometimes if that's the only model that you've had direct experience with, it's hard to know what am I comparing it to. What could be, how quickly could we have implemented, a cloud-based best-of-breed tool that, would and how much more cost-effective would it be, those kinds of things. So to some extent, it may just be not having that frame of reference.
Now, that is an interesting point, going to the P2P world, going to the analyst marketplaces, that absence of a frame of reference. And believe it or not, the no answer seems to be a logical extension of the results of the first poll. Is that a challenge resulting from the fact that the analyst community hasn't relayed the information as effectively? Is it that the P2P providers haven't gotten out the message? Or is this not having the answer, the 67% who are still ERP-based and not having the answer, is that part of the fact is that we've got to go through that generational transformation that you had alluded to beforehand to get that context, Richard? I mean, do you see the question I'm asking here?
I do, yeah, and it's a tough one, to answer, but I know you referenced earlier Gartner's sort of treatise on this notion and the term that they've coined, postmodern ERP, and I would certainly encourage all of our attendees to get a hold of that report and read it, because at its essence it's really giving procurement ammunition to go make the case that says we're beyond what the ERP can provide us in terms of our ability to deliver on our charter, and to be as effective as we can, the most efficient kind of procurement processes, the highest savings that we can generate. Gartner's basically said, and to a large extent, their biggest constituency probably is IT. So they've kind of given you, some talking points, a manifesto here to be able to go to IT or the business leadership and say there's something better, and this is the clear trend in the market, and we need to get on board with it, or we won't be as competitive as we need to be. So I do think there's there's information out there that can help those folks make the case if they want to sort of push ahead and take part in this evolution.
Well, you know, it's kind of interesting. We're getting some comments here, and this is great interaction. A couple of comments have been is that one just came through is they don't have the answer because we say, what is the answer? It's because they want to see what non-ERP solutions would be better after they are implemented, and please show us how they will do better. I think that's something you'll get to towards your section when I hand the reins over to you again, Richard, but that was an interesting thing because people are still a wait and see. At least that's what I get from that statement is, you know, show us how are they going to be better. And that's another reflection, you know, of an extension of a thought is saying is that do they have the functionality? It seems to be that a lot of things, and we talked about the obstacles to adoption, is that there is this belief that had existed previously that how can something be implemented within weeks and days and still have the same capabilities or capacity of a system or an ERP backend that takes months and years to implement. I mean, does that kind of comment surprise you, or does it really reflect of a healthy skepticism?
I always like a healthy skepticism, you know. In the U.S., folks from Missouri say they're from the show me state, so you got to show me and prove it to me. But you know, I think if you look at what are some of the contributing factors, well, most ERP solutions are still on premise, you know, behind the firewall, which number one means that you've got a whole host of activities that need to be completed in order to deploy any ERP solution or even go through an upgrade process of ERP in terms of provisioning servers, hardware, you know, installing software. It means you got to have all your IT resources at the ready to do that versus a cloud-based model where you can offload all that to your solution provider. You don't have any of that requirement to you know, provision the hardware and software. In the cloud model, the software is a utility, like turning on the lights or the electricity. It's just there. And you remove so many of those obstacles. It's only one factor, but there's a number of reasons from a practical and technical standpoint why these solutions can be implemented so much more quickly to drive time to value.
Well, you know what, and here's an interesting thing, and you know what, we could probably talk about this, you and I, Richard, all day, but I guess we do have to progress a little bit. But one point that came out from a comment is that somebody had written that I misunderstood your first poll. Our P2P system is not provided by our ERP, but is integrated with ERP. And I think that's an important point to make as we go forward here, is that remember, when we talk about being P2P, or rather ERP driven, we're not talking about an integration. We're talking about it being resident within the actual ERP framework. But on the other side, your P2P, and to be an effective P2P solution, integration with the ERP is essential. So I think, Richard, you'll agree, we're not talking about an either-or proposition. What we're talking about is extending ERP capability into leveraging the cloud and leveraging the new P2P platforms. I mean, that's a fair thing to say, correct?
It is. You know, I think I mentioned earlier, I see it as a peaceful coexistence, that they do need to be present and complement one another. And the good news is, from a technology standpoint, all the technology platforms are so much more open and standards-based now that we've also removed what would have been one of the earlier barriers to this hybrid model, if you will, which is ERP plus best-of-breed, in that the integration can be accomplished so much more easily and quickly than ever before.
Absolutely. Now, as we go through the slide, in terms of, we're going to look at the ERP from the doom loop standpoint. And one of the things, and it's hard to remember because ERP has been around so long, but I mean, ERP was at one time a breakthrough technology. It was the earlier stages of evolution. I remember the very early days of the ERP, going back into the late 90s in particular. And so when you look at how something begins and how it starts, one of the things that I would say, and I'll compare this going forward with the flywheel concept, is that the current solutions, the P2P solutions, have actually gained from the experience of the past. I'd say the P2P solutions are a reflection of what we have learned, both the good and the bad from the ERP standpoint. So when we look at the beginning of the doom loop with ERP, we have to do it in a concept of fairness that, let's face it, there was no historical reference point at that time by which we could relate to, well, is this good or not? It was the starting point. But we were starting point with ERPs was, again, a very new territory, trailblazing. I think that would be a fair thing to say, right, Richard?
Oh, absolutely. I'm right there with you.
And so as a result of that, and not being able to have any contextual reference point, the results were disappointing. And there are many high-profile and other types of initiatives, procurement initiatives that were ERP-based that failed to deliver the result. And by the way, this wasn't just limited to the end-user customer. One of the most famous cases that was cited by a Red Monk analyst was when HP was attempting to put in their own supply chain solution. And at the time, and I found it very interesting reading, at the time they were, of course, trying to promote themselves as being an integrator and being able to implement ERP solutions. And the Red Monk analyst said, quote unquote, if they can't successfully install it for themselves, how can they do it for others? And it sounds harsh, but the reality is that when you are blazing that new trail and implementing technologies and the limitations that we now recognize existed with that technology, the challenges weren't just confined to the end user customers, but even many of these organizations within implementing, such as Hewlett-Packard, implementing their own solutions had encountered difficulties. So these disappointing results are of course, lead into the next phase is that what do we do to try to fix it? And it is very hard, and Richard, I think you'll probably attest to this, given your experience as mine, is it's very hard when you've got the light of scrutiny and the need to justify a multi-million-dollar expenditure. It's very hard to take your time to think it through. You're really in reaction mode, and a lot of the decisions that you make are based upon fixing an immediate problem within a very narrow scope of understanding. I mean, is that a fair statement?
Well, I think it is. You know, it's a matter of having all of the information to make data-driven decisions, and without all the information, it's very difficult to do.
And then as we go to the last part of the equation, and this is the key, and I think this changes things so very, very dramatically, is purchasing was rarely, if ever, involved in the process relative to the selection of an ERP system. In fact, it would be safe to say, and Richard, you'll probably want to add into this, but from my perception and experience, is purchasing was seen as an adjunct of a finance. I mean, we've had many organizations talk about bridging the gap of misunderstanding or the disconnect between finance and purchasing, but very much so is that purchasing people were almost an afterthought with that process, and that also contributed to this doom loop, is because you weren't asked to consult, you weren't involved, you were required in many instances to adopt. And by the way, and Richard, your comment about being a people issue, I remember a CPO agenda roundtable where they talked about the fact that the majority of people who attend, and these from large organizations globally, Dan and all these other large organizations, and many of them did not see a value in the procurement professional. And one person attending that, who was a CPO, made a move from one large company to the next, and he said this. He said, when I was at the former company, I was very much actively involved in the major capital expenditures and purchasing and strategy. When I moved to my new company, even though I had a higher level of responsibility and positioning within the organization, I was not involved in those critical meetings, and I was more or less dictated or directed as to, after the fact, what we needed to do to drive savings. And I think that goes to the people situation as well, that extends beyond the technology, doesn't it, Richard?
It does. You know, in fact, I think one of the comments we've gotten, and we've gotten a lot of interaction, which is great, was that in their experience, you know, finance was number one, IT was number two, procurement was a distant third, if that, in terms of, you know, the influence and involvement in the process. And again, for anybody who finds themselves still sort of stuck in that situation, I'd encourage them to get a hold of the Gartner report, Postmodern ERP, that basically says, gives procurement a license, you know, and says it's, the verdict is in, ERP alone will not enable you to achieve the kinds of returns that the business expects from you, so use that as a way to help make that argument.
Well, and by the way, somebody's asking about credit card and transparency without P2P integration. If we don't get around to answering your question on this, because we have a limited time, and again, Richard, you and I could probably talk about this for the next 2 hours. We don't have that timeline. But certainly the chat afterwards may be a worthwhile venue for that. But as we progress through, it all leads into the question, I think, will P2P purchasing solutions avoid the ERP legacy trap? Will they have the flywheel effect, and how will that occur? And in that regard, to move things along, I'm going to pose this question to our attendees. Will purchasing solutions avoid this trap? How have they improved upon the ERP model? How have they structured, or how is the emerging technologies, the cloud-based P2P, how has that improved upon the previous approach and methodology through ERP-based procurement solutions? What have we learned from that, and have we learned enough so that we're not going to be having this same conversation 3 years from now, 5 years from now? I mean, that's an interesting question, isn't it, Richard? I mean, what's different about the P2P now? Did we learn from the ERP e-procurement solutions to prevent us from falling into that trap?
Great question. I don't know that we've learned enough to overcome basic human nature, which I think is to take something that's good and tweak it, customize it. And I think that, the point of a big part of that legacy trap was the fact that those ERP solutions became so customized that made it difficult to maintain, to keep up to date with the latest technology trends and so on. And the encouraging part, I sort of started off as a downer there, but I think we will avoid it primarily because there's no other option. Cloud is so predominant that part and parcel of the cloud model is you're not able to customize everything. You're in that case, great. The great being something that's so customized and tailored just for you is actually the enemy of good. And I think we will avoid it, if for no other reason other than the cloud forces us away from that legacy custom type of mindset.
Well, it's kind of interesting, and going through this, and what's interesting about the poll results, and I appreciate everyone's answers with regards to this, is that 25% believe that we will, 38% say no, and 38% is not sure. And what is interesting about this response and these numbers, Richard, are the fact that they almost reflect the mirror of the first question of how many people still have ERP-based procurement solutions and how many are onto the new P2P platforms. It almost seems to be a mirrored reflection to a certain degree of those previous poll results. So it's almost, if it's safe to say, and maybe correct me on this, is the 25% are probably those who have taken the plunge or crossed over to the P2P. The 38% who say no are still entrenched into an ERP-based solution, and the 38% who aren't sure are those who are the bridge between the ERP and the P2P adoption. Is that a fair assessment in terms of these numbers?
I'd expect that same correlation, absolutely.
Okay, so now let's look at this, and Richard, I'm going to turn the ball back over to you. Look, I jumped ahead too far on the slide, so why don't I turn the ball back over to you. Oh, you already have the ball. Let's turn it over to you in terms of taking us to the next level of understanding of P2P.
Absolutely, and I do think we're in the throes of a P2P renaissance, P2P 2.0, if you will. And to kind of give some substantiation to that, just look at how rapidly this market is growing. And after all, the first e-procurement models, and I was there, we did some of these at GE before there were any other models in the market in the late 90s, for example. So it's actually a fairly mature market space, but we're in this 2.0 renaissance, and it's driving dramatic market growth. So based on Forrester's WAVE report on e-procurement that just came out in May of this year, the market is growing at a healthy 11% per year, so double-digit growth. So that the market being, the amount of money spent on procure-to-pay and e-procurement solutions grew from about $3.8 billion in 2016 to $4.3 billion in 2017. So what's driving this growth? It's ease of use for a large part, and a big part of what helped build this model, in fact, was the consumer-type experience. People in their private lives going and booking trips, you know, on a kayak or shopping on Amazon or doing Google searches, that then expect the same type of user experience when they come to an enterprise application at work. And I think even though those consumer models would have been the impetus for this, what Forrester points out is that the volumes in business to business, about $3 trillion worth of purchases in business to business are more than 3 times what businesses buy directly from sell-side e-commerce sites. So it's really about duplicating and replicating that consumer experience, but doing it within a more controlled business-to-business purchasing environment. So, you know, the things that procurement leaders want to avoid in deploying P2P, they don't want their end users shopping directly at sell-side e-commerce sites where they're encouraged to make maverick purchases, non-approved or non-contracted items. So what these e-procurement systems are designed to do is really drive that ease of use, but within a controlled environment. So end users are only buying from curated, approved vendor catalogs with contracted items at negotiated prices. And, you know, be able to not only manage spending, but also manage demand, so giving procurement better visibility to, in some cases, defer or deny purchases as well. So there's a lot of enterprise or business-to-business specific capabilities that need to be there alongside that consumer-like ease of use, and that's driving this rebirth in e-procurement, if you will, all this part of Forrester's WAVE report, in which Zycus is prominently featured as a leader in this market space as well. Some of the key findings I'll just highlight from the Forrester WAVE report, and really gives us some insight to how far these solutions have evolved is, you know, that for instance, it's not just about transactions. We are talking about requisitions and POs and invoices, which are transactions, but it's about how the best-of-breed tools are incorporating artificial intelligence and analytics to drive customer centricity as a key differentiator. And given how far these tools have evolved, I think the other key finding that Forrester refers to is when you set about choosing a procure-to-pay solution, this is very much a long-term bet. You know, other procurement tools may be confined just to the professional procurement user, tools like e-sourcing or spend analytics, but deploying P2P is potentially across the entire employee population. So it's a much bigger footprint, it's a longer-term bet, and of course their advice is to utilize leaders, and we've provided the quote here about what Forrester had to say about Zycus. I won't read it, but certainly those leaders that have that longer vision to be a safe long-term bet, that are incorporating the leading-edge technologies like AI, like analytics, and driving that kind of customer-centric, user-friendly solution that can give you the adoption that you're looking for. And ultimately, I think what most procurement groups are looking to do is sort of make this switch, flipping the switch from a tactically oriented procurement function to a strategic function. And we look at some benchmark data here that comes from CAPS Research, which is the Center for Advanced Purchasing Studies at Arizona State University, and we look across industries. I think it's pretty revealing to see that you know, the majority, better than 60% on average of a procurement department's resources, the human capital, is dedicated to tactical transactional processing as opposed to strategic activities, things like supplier performance management, supplier relationship, you know, category management, strategic sourcing, those kinds of things. And I think it's pretty evident that most organizations would like to invert that pyramid. How do we reduce the percentage of time that we have to spend on tactical transactional processing so we can free up those precious procurement headcount, that staff resource, to be more strategic? So that's really what the that, again, that human element of the P2P proposition is about flipping the script from tactical to strategic. And I think it's helpful to look at what does success look like. If we're going to do this P2P 2.0 transformation, and this is or Hackett Group that has kind of provided 3 top characteristics of the world-class P2P performers, if you will, and it includes a focus on internal stakeholders, information digitization, and process automation, and some benchmarks that are helpful along the way to kind of figure out where you are on your journey. They say that, for instance, the top performers, in terms of their focus on internal stakeholders, are able to really provide this kind of guided buying model that drives requisitioners to the preferred channels, the preferred approved contracted vendor, also the most efficient way to buy and pay for that process. So they're able to do that 85% of the time, whereas on average, just about 61%. So, of course, that means nearly 40% on average are making a non-preferred type of purchase, usually meaning a maverick purchase. So that's savings leakage, it's inefficiency, and those kinds of things. And we just highlighted ways where Zycus has been able to achieve that leader position in the Forrester way, things like utilizing artificial intelligence to drive a guided buying model, really providing that focus on internal stakeholders. Next comes the information digitization. So top performers have almost twice as much visibility to line item spend data, and that's one of the byproducts of a successful P2P implementation from a procurement standpoint. It's not just about making users happy, that's an important part of it, but they also are the beneficiaries of accurately coded and classified transactional data. So on the back end, getting spend visibility to make better strategic sourcing decisions, and they have twice as much visibility to that line item level spend data, and also much higher compliance to contracts. So 67% of spend for top performers, better than 2/3, is actually compliant to the contract, where it's less than 50% for the peer group. And this is another area where one of the innovations that Zycus has brought is something we call the contract lock. So it's not just P2P, but the tight coupling and integration of contract management, such that, especially for those non-catalog requisitions, services spend, or non-standard products, where you have to have the contract in place at the point of requisition to make sure that those purchases are in fact compliant as well. And third and final characteristic of a top performer is that they've really automated the entire end-to-end process, including significantly, the collaboration, the exchange of business documents with third-party suppliers. So it starts with no touch or electronic POs. Top performers almost twice as frequently have automated the PO process, and on the back end even more, an even greater disparity. So they're almost 4 times as likely to have, or almost 4 times as much of their invoice volume that they've already converted from a paper-based process to electronic invoicing. And getting that type of process efficiency end-to-end really means doing an effective job of onboarding and enabling your suppliers to achieve that. So we talked a little bit about one of the ways to make the case for evolving towards this P2P 2.0, towards a best-of-breed model, driving higher value and returns beyond that first-generation kind of ERP approach. It often comes down to the numbers. So a lot of detailed metrics here, but essentially when we look across the P2P implementation, an organization that could progress from an average type of benchmark performance to best in class could conservatively expect to generate 2 to 3% return on that. So if you're an organization that had $100 million in spend, for example, that's nearly $3 million in return. And it goes across, categories. That's through contract compliance, through transactional process efficiency, and early pay discounts or credit card rebates. And I know we had a number of questions about credit cards, for example, and to some extent, it seems like some of the questions may be saying, is this an alternative? Can we go credit card instead of best-of-breed P2P or ERP-based P2P? And I think that the answer is that it's utilizing all of these tools in combination. So, for example, the credit card systems or credit card programs are not really anything new in and of themselves either. It's just that they haven't been deployed as broadly as many organizations would like because they lack the inherent controls over those spending. So the best practice answer is, how do I integrate the card payment method into the P2P process so that I have the front-end control over the spending? That requisition is going through an approved, approval routing process before a PO is generated, and the card is then integrated as a payment method that produces all kinds of benefits. It generates rebate income. It takes an invoice out of the cycle altogether, and through integration, it can also more effectively enable the back-end general ledger posting of the card transactions that come through on the billing statement from the bank. But maybe that's a topic for another day. But in any case, very compelling returns to go from where you likely are today, if you're like, the average, like most everyone else, to achieve a best-in-class type of performance. And finally, I'll just share a quick case study because this one I think is very germane to our topic today, a post-ERP, because this insurance company, in fact, the starting point was ERP-based procure-to-pay solution. Happened to be using SAP, but I'm not really picking on them. It could be any ERP. And the challenge was they didn't have really a standardized process for onboarding suppliers or approving requisitions, led to rampant, non-PO type spend that caused a lot of extra effort and rework on the back end when the invoice, that no PO invoice shows up, and you don't really know what the purpose of the purchase was or if it was approved and how it's to be accounted for. So at the end of the day, there was really no single version of the truth. So they did take the step to go to, in this case, the Zycus solution for a P2P 2.0 type approach, and have really seen some dramatic gains. And a big part of this, as I stressed a moment ago, is being able to enable and onboard suppliers. And that doesn't mean all suppliers in one fell swoop, but as with most things, the 80-20 rule applies. So find those 20% of P2P suppliers that are likely generating 80% or more of the transactions and enable them and prioritize them for enablement through the system. And that's what was done here. So take, in this case, 500 suppliers, utilize whatever means they're capable of accessing from a technology standpoint. So within that 20% of suppliers, again, the 80-20 rule applied here. 20% of those are the larger e-commerce capable suppliers that are enabled through a standard protocol like CXML or EDI, but the other 80% can just come through a browser accessible portal and start to generate the type of efficiencies and benefits that drive that business case of 2 to 3% savings. Some of the results here, dramatically shrinking cycle times, not only on orders but also on invoices, which allow you then to maximize early pay discounts, get better visibility to just eliminating duplicate payments, for example, in this case saved $100,000 alone, and ultimately freeing up about 40% more time for everyone involved in the process to be more strategic as a result. So John, I know we're about at the end here. I did want to mention that for those folks who want to do a deeper dive into procure-to-pay, we will have an event coming up. We call it a live demo connect. So you can see how these innovations are driving procure-to-pay forward and what's the art of the possible. And so this Demo Connect will occur on September the 5th. And we invite everyone today to come back and join us for that as well. And I guess just, we don't have much time left, John, but, we talked a little bit about the human element. And I thought as we go through this, we're talking about the evolution of P2P technology. How would you see this changing procurement's role going forward in the future for those that sort of gain these types of efficiencies, that flip that switch from being tactical to more strategic? What does that mean to their lives as a procurement professional?
Well, it's an interesting question, Richard, because I often thought, well, how much has technology influenced procurement and how much has procurement influenced technology? I think really what's interesting in this progress, looking back at the ERP, I think technology was very much the driving force in terms of the procurement world. And, we talked about the people element. And I remember once giving a lecture in front of a group of people, and someone in the audience coined it, saying it's the Rodney Dangerfield effect with procurement professionals. We get no respect. We're not involved with this. I think what's happened now, and how I see this progressing and how to avoid that doom loop going forward, is that procurement professionals and what we do are seen as being strategic. It's not an adjunct function now. And I think we're now entering the realm through the P2P world of where, rather than being influenced by technology, procurement professionals are now the ones driving technology. Procurement professionals are now the ones contributing to that insight. And so going forward, the human factor, the people factor is that a lot of the pitfalls, a lot of the context that was absent in the early ERP days are now going to be present, because not only do we have the benefits of history to learn from a technological standpoint, but what we've now learned is to put technology in the control of people rather than the other way around. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my perception. What do you think?
I couldn't agree more, John, absolutely. And, we've generated a lot of great conversation and interest here. I know a number of the attendees have also been asking for the slide deck, which you will receive, so you'll get an email as a follow-up to this webinar today that'll include the slides for you as well. And I think some of the other questions that really come to mind here, John, really talk about the future of the ERP in this new model, the postmodern ERP. Any thoughts? I know we kind of said ERP isn't really going anywhere, but what is the future of ERP, and what can we expect as the next breakthrough in P2P?
Well, I think the reality is ERP has now been relegated to its rightful position. I mean, there are functionality within the ERP, and just to digress, one of the biggest challenges with ERP is the expectation upon what it was capable of doing. And I think in many cases, the high rate of initiative failure came about because it collapsed under the weight of its own expectations. Now when you look at ERP through a more effective lens and the integration capability with P2P, I think what you're doing now is you again are relegating it to its proper functionality, its realm, where it will serve and continue to serve a purpose. Now, one of the things that I find interesting, though, is with the emergence of P2P solutions, a lot of people are now acknowledging the influence and the impact that P2P has on the way procurement is done and the emergence of the cloud. But it's kind of humorous. They say, well, now it's a case of the tail wagging the dog, which is the front end. Because remember those early days, Richard, e-procurement solutions were very much considered, and I consider this a derogative term, a bolt-on solution. Well, it's no longer a bolt-on solution. It is, in fact, it's the cockpit of a successful procurement practice. But that bridge, where you say, where we had that poll of 69% are still on ERP base, 33% say no, we're all following the legacy, 33% say they don't know. I think that's the realization now that comes into play is that we're still in that tail wagging the dog where there's an acceptance of the outside or the integration of the P2P solutions, that it's still seen as being an adjunct to the ERP world. And I think that's where we're going to see the biggest change. That's where we're going to see the transition. And I think that's the biggest work that companies like Zycus have. If anything, and I'm sure you'll agree, Richard, that the poll results say, you know what, we have progressed very well in terms of getting the message out and demonstrating the value of P2P, but the poll results say we still have a lot of work to do. I mean, I don't know if you would agree with that, but that's my take.
We do have a lot of work to do, and for my part, I think looking ahead from a P2P standpoint, what's the next breakthrough, what's on the horizon, I think we're going to see these kind of arbitrary distinctions of P2P fade away, because after all, procure-to-pay is part of a larger process. It's part of source-to-pay. So we're going to see that less and less of a bifurcation between this downstream transactional procure-to-pay process, and in fact a tighter integration with the upstream strategic sourcing, category management, spend analytics, all those kinds of things working together. So just as you said, John, I think we could go on for hours, but I want to thank you for a very stimulating conversation today. Thank everyone for attending and being so interactive and collaborative. Please come back and join us for the live Demo Connect event on September 5th and on future webinars where we hope to carry the conversation forward. So thanks everyone for joining today.